The wax seal bore the crest of the Duke of Ashford, pressed into crimson years before, by hands now cold in the grave. Edward Ashford, the new Duke, barely 24 and still wearing mourning black, broke it with trembling fingers in the lamplight of his father's study. The parchment unfolded like a confession. His eyes moved across the lines once, twice, then a third time as the blood drained from his face. A brother, a legitimate son, born before his parents' marriage, hidden away for 2 decades, and a command: restore him or curse your honor forever. The letter slipped from Edward's hands as the study door creaked open behind him. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Edward Ashford had never imagined the title would feel so much like a shackle. 6 months had passed since his father's sudden death from apoplexy, and in that half-year, the young Duke had learned that inheriting one of England's most venerable estates meant inheriting its debts, its expectations, and the watchful eyes of every ambitious family in the Regency ton. The sprawling manor of Ashford Park, with its Palladian columns and manicured gardens stretching across Hertfordshire, had been his childhood paradise. Now, it was a maze of responsibilities he navigated alone. The estate managers treated him with barely concealed condescension. "Your father would have decided differently, Your Grace," became the refrain that haunted his days. Edward's youth, his gentle demeanor, his preference for books over hunting, his hesitation to dismiss long-serving tenants who fell behind on rent, marked him as weak in their eyes. Even his mother, the Dowager Duchess, regarded him with a mixture of concern and disappointment from her rooms in the East Wing, where she'd retreated into mourning so deep it bordered on abandonment. "You must marry Edward," she told him during one of their stilted dinners, her voice echoing in the cavernous dining room designed for parties of 50. "The Montrose girl would be suitable. Her father controls half the mills in Lancashire, and Lord Montrose has made his interest quite clear. Clarissa Montrose. Edward had danced with her twice at Lady Pemberton's ball. She was beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, perfect, cold, and utterly uninterested in anything he said. But marriages in their circle were transactions, not romances, and the Ashford coffers needed the Montrose fortune. His father had left the estate land-rich but cash-poor, a common affliction among old families watching industrialists rise. "I've agreed to nothing," Edward said quietly, though he knew resistance was futile. His cousin, Lord Gerard Ashford, had already begun circulating rumours that Edward lacked the spine for his position. Gerard, 10 years Edward's senior and possessed of the ruthless charm their family was famous for, positioned himself as the estate's unofficial advisor and constant critic. "The boy plays at being Duke," Gerard told anyone who would listen at White's. "Ashford Park needs a man's hand, not a scholar's hesitation." Edward felt the weight of those judgments every day. He rose before dawn to ride the estate boundaries, learning every field and cottage, every tenant's name and circumstance. He spent evenings in his father's study, now his study, poring over ledgers and correspondence, searching for solutions to problems that seemed to multiply like weeds. The late Duke had been a commanding presence, decisive and sometimes harsh. Edward knew he was neither, and the comparison haunted him. It was on one such evening in late October, with autumn rain drumming against the windows and the fire burning low, that Edward decided to tackle the last task he'd been avoiding: sorting through his father's personal papers. The solicitors had handled the will, the official documents, the financial instruments, but the late Duke's private desk remained untouched, locked drawers filled with letters and journals Edward felt intrusive examining. He found the key in a Chinese lacquer box his father had kept on the mantelpiece. The desk was mahogany, imported decades ago, its surface scarred by years of correspondence and decisions that had shaped lives. Edward worked through the drawers methodically. Letters from his childhood, accounts from the estate's glory days, a bundle of notes from his mother when she and his father had been courting. The final drawer stuck, Edward had to force it, and when it opened he found only a single envelope. It was addressed in his father's hand, to Edward, Duke of Ashford, to be opened only by him and only after my death. His heart began to pound. The envelope was sealed with his father's personal signet, the wax unbroken. Edward's hand shook as he broke the seal, and in that moment, with rain and wind howling outside and the fire casting dancing shadows across the study walls, he unfolded the letter that would shatter everything he thought he knew. The words swam before his eyes. He read them once in disbelief, then again in growing horror. His father's confession spilled across the pages in a hand grown shaky with illness or emotion. Before his marriage to Edward's mother, before his ascension to the dukedom upon his own father's death, the late Duke had fallen in love with a merchant's daughter named Catherine Wright. She had been beautiful, intelligent, and entirely unsuitable for a future duke. They had married secretly in a small church in Kent, witnessed by a country vicar and two strangers pulled in from the road. But duty had called. The old Duke, Edward's grandfather, had arranged a match with Lady Helena Sutherland, daughter of an earl, a woman of impeccable breeding and substantial fortune. Edward's father had been given a choice: honor his secret marriage and be disinherited, cast out from everything his family represented, or annul the marriage and fulfill his obligations to his blood and name. He had chosen duty. The marriage to Catherine Wright was quietly dissolved, paid for, erased, buried in legal documents and bribes. Catherine had been given a settlement and sent away. And then, 3 months later, she had written to inform him she was carrying his child. "I could not acknowledge him," the letter read, the words seemingly torn from a soul in torment. To do so would have destroyed everything. The family name, my position, your mother's reputation, and your own future inheritance. I arranged for Catherine and the child to be cared for, provided for through intermediaries, but never claimed. His name is Thomas Wright. He would be 26 now, 2 years your senior. He is your brother, Edward, born of a legal marriage, however briefly it stood. And he is, by the laws of succession and primogeniture, the rightful Duke of Ashford. The letter continued, detailing the arrangements made, the money provided, the last known whereabouts of Catherine and her son, his son. And then came the command that stopped Edward's heart. I was a coward, Edward. I chose comfort over conscience, and I have paid for it in sleepless nights, and a guilt that has eaten at me like a canker. I dare not reveal this while living, but I cannot die with this sin unconfessed. You must find him. You must restore what I stole. If you are truly the man I hope you've become, you will do what honor demands, even at the cost of everything you hold dear. Make right what I made wrong. The letter ended with his father's signature and a date, written just days before his death. Edward sat motionless as the fire burned down to embers. The implications crashed over him in waves. Everything he had inherited, the title, the lands, the responsibilities he'd struggled so hard to master, none of it was rightfully his. He was the second son, elevated by his father's duplicity and cowardice. And somewhere in England lived a man who should be sitting in this study, bearing this title, carrying this burden. The door to the study creaked. Edward's head snapped up. His cousin Gerard stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed even at this late hour, his eyes sharp and curious in the lamplight. "Working late, cousin?" Gerard asked, his tone casual but his gaze fixed on the letter in Edward's hands. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Edward's fingers tightened on the parchment. Every instinct screamed to hide it, to burn it, to pretend he'd never opened that drawer. But his father's final words echoed in his mind. "Do what honor demands." "Gerard," Edward heard himself say, his voice strange in his own ears. "I need to tell you something." The decision to confide in Gerard proved to be Edward's first mistake, though he would not realize it until much later. That night, with the letter laid bare between them on the study desk, Gerard had read it twice in silence. His expression had remained carefully neutral, But Edward caught the flash of calculation in his cousin's eyes, the look of a chess player who'd just seen the board shift in his favour. "Extraordinary," Gerard had finally said, returning the letter with steady hands. "Your father kept this secret for decades. One must almost admire the discipline, however misguided." He poured them both brandy from the decanter, his movements precise. "But Edward, you understand what acknowledging this would mean? You'd be declaring yourself illegitimate to your own title. The scandal would be nuclear. The family would be torn apart." "The man is my brother," Edward said, the words still foreign on his tongue. "And he's the rightful heir." "Is he?" Gerard leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid. "A marriage annulled before your parents wed. The legal questions alone could tie the courts in knots for years. And this Thomas Wright, what do we know of him? He could be a drunkard, a fool, completely unsuitable to bear the title. Your father had his reasons for secrecy, Edward. Perhaps you should honour those rather than this deathbed dramatics." But Edward had shaken his head, some core of stubbornness, or perhaps integrity, asserting itself. "I need to find him first. Speak with him. Then I'll know what must be done." Gerard had agreed too readily, offering to make discreet inquiries. "These matters require delicacy," he'd said. "Let me handle the investigation. You have the estate to run, the Montrose alliance to secure. No need to draw attention until we understand the full situation." Edward had accepted, grateful to share the burden. It was only later that he would understand how thoroughly he'd been played. 3 weeks passed. Gerard reported that his inquiries were proving difficult. The trail was old. The intermediaries his father had used were dead or impossible to locate. "These things take time," he assured Edward over dinner. But Edward noticed other changes. Gerard began attending estate meetings uninvited, offering opinions that the managers increasingly deferred to. The Dowager Duchess, whom Gerard visited regularly, began making pointed comments about Edward's judgment and temperament. "Your cousin tells me you've been under considerable strain," she said one afternoon in her sitting room. "Perhaps you should take the waters at Bath. Gerard could manage things here." The walls were closing in, though Edward couldn't yet see the architecture of the trap. He threw himself into the search, conducting his own inquiries through his father's old solicitors, writing to parish churches in Kent, searching for any record of Catherine Wright and her son. The responses came back maddeningly vague or unhelpful. The church where the marriage allegedly took place had burned down 15 years ago, its records lost. The solicitors claimed client privilege, even in death. Catherine Wright seemed to have vanished into England's teeming masses. It was in mid-November when the summons came. Lord Montrose requested Edward's presence at Montrose House in London to discuss matters of mutual interest. Edward understood the euphemism. The marriage offer was becoming formal, and refusing would be interpreted as an insult. His mother insisted he accept, and Gerard volunteered to accompany him for support. Montrose House stood in Grosvenor Square, a testament to industrial wealth trying to purchase aristocratic respectability. Lord Montrose, a broad-shouldered man who'd made his fortune in textile mills and coal, greeted them in a drawing room decorated with paintings too new and gilded frames too ornate, the hallmarks of money unsure of its taste. "Ashford, good of you to come," Montrose boomed, pumping Edward's hand with crushing enthusiasm. "I trust Gerard has explained the terms. £50,000 settled on Clarissa at marriage, another £25,000 payable to the estate immediately upon betrothal. Your lands, my capital, a perfect union." Edward felt like livestock being appraised. Clarissa sat beside her father, her expression one of studied boredom. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, with golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets and a figure that drew every eye at balls. But when Edward tried to engage her in conversation, asking about her interests or education, she responded in monosyllables before returning her attention to the fashion plates on her lap. "The wedding could be in spring," Montrose continued, mapping out Edward's future as though he'd already agreed. "St. George's, Hanover Square, naturally. Then the season. Let society see the new Duchess." Good for business, good for the family name. Gerard watched with a slight smile, saying nothing but radiating approval. Edward felt the room shrink around him. This was his future, a mercenary marriage to a woman who viewed him as a title to acquire, binding him to obligations that would make the truth about Thomas Wright impossible to reveal. "I need time," Edward said, the words emerging more forcefully than he'd intended. "I cannot commit to this immediately." Montrose's jovial expression cooled. "Time? We've been discussing this for weeks through intermediaries, Your Grace. I understood the matter was all but settled." "My father's death is still recent," Edward replied, improvising. "I require a period of mourning before I can properly consider marriage." It was a thin excuse, and Montrose's narrowed eyes showed he knew it, but social convention provided cover. "Very well," he said curtly. "But don't wait too long, Ashford. A man in your position needs heirs, and opportunities don't linger forever." The ride back to Ashford Park was tense. Gerard maintained a wounded silence until they were miles from London, then turned on Edward with barely contained fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Montrose will interpret that as an insult. The settlement he offered was extraordinarily generous, more than generous, frankly, given the state of our finances, and you humiliated him in his own home." "I couldn't agree to it," Edward said, "not with everything unresolved." "You mean this fantasy about a lost brother?" Gerard's voice dripped with contempt. "Edward, wake up. That letter was written by a dying man, possibly addled with laudanum and fever. Even if this Thomas Wright exists, even if the marriage was valid, which is highly doubtful, you have no obligation to destroy your life over it. Your father made his choice. Let it stay buried." But Edward couldn't. The letter had infected him like a disease, making every privilege feel like theft. He lay awake nights, imagining this unknown brother, where he lived, what he did, whether he knew anything of his true heritage. The idea of taking vows to Clarissa, of producing heirs to a title that wasn't rightfully his, became intolerable. He began his own investigation in earnest, riding out before dawn to avoid Gerard's questions, visiting London archives and church records personally. And slowly, painstakingly, a trail emerged. Catherine Wright had moved to Surrey after the annulment, married a country doctor named Thomas Wright Sr., and raised her son under her new husband's name. The doctor had died in the cholera epidemic of 1832, and Catherine had passed away from consumption 3 years later. The boy, Edward's half-brother, had been 15 at the time. After that, the trail grew cold. But Edward found one more lead. A former servant of Catherine's, now living in a charity house in Southwark, who remembered a quiet, serious boy who'd been apprenticed to a cartographer in London after his mother's death. It took 2 more weeks, but Edward finally found him. Thomas Wright, now 26, operated a small but respected map-making business in Clerkenwell, catering to merchant ships and explorers. Edward stood across the street from the modest shopfront, heart hammering, trying to find the courage to cross the threshold. The man who emerged to flip the shop sign to "closed" could have been his reflection in a distorted mirror. Thomas Wright was taller, broader in the shoulders, his hands ink-stained and calloused from his trade. But the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the distinctive Ashford nose, these were unmistakable. This was his brother. This was the true Duke. Edward crossed the street, each step feeling like walking to his own execution. He pushed open the shop door, triggering a bell. Thomas looked up from the counter where he was rolling a map, his expression shifting from professional welcome to puzzlement at the well-dressed stranger entering just as he was closing. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're closed for the evening," Thomas said. His voice was educated but lacked the polish of aristocratic schooling. "If you'd care to return tomorrow—" "My name is Edward Ashford," Edward interrupted, and watched recognition dawn. Not of him, but of the name itself. Thomas's face went very still. "I believe we need to talk about your mother, Catherine Wright, and the Duke who was once her husband." The colour drained from Thomas's face. His hand gripped the counter's edge as if to steady himself. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Thomas walked to the shop door, locked it, and pulled down the shade. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. "You'd better tell me everything," he said quietly, "because if you've come here to offer me money to stay silent, you've wasted your time. My mother told me the truth on her deathbed. I know exactly who I am and who you are, and I've spent 11 years deciding what, if anything, to do about it." Edward drew the letter from his coat pocket. "Then you should read this," he said, "because my father, our father, has made that decision for us both." Thomas Wright read the letter 3 times in the lamplight of his modest shop, surrounded by rolled maps and the smell of ink and vellum. Edward watched his brother's face transform with each pass, shock giving way to anger, anger to something more complex that Edward couldn't decipher. When Thomas finally set the letter down, his hands were trembling slightly. "He felt guilty," Thomas said, his voice flat. "How comforting. My mother died in a rented room above an apothecary, coughing blood into rags we couldn't afford to replace, but he felt guilty." The bitterness in those words cut deeper than rage would have. Edward had rehearsed a dozen speeches on the ride to London, but they all crumbled in the face of his brother's pain. "I can't defend what he did," Edward said quietly. "I can only tell you what I intend to do about it." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound without humour. "You intend to restore my rights, hand over Ashford Park and the title with a ribbon and a bow. Forgive me, your grace, but men don't give up dukedoms. They don't wake up and decide to become commoners out of principle." "I'm not my father," Edward said. "I won't be a coward." "No." Thomas leaned against the counter, studying Edward with eyes that were disconcertingly like looking in a mirror. "Then you're a fool. Do you understand what you're proposing? The scandal alone would destroy both of us. Every newspaper in England would feast on this story. The legitimate duke who wasn't. The secret heir emerging from obscurity. Society would tear us apart for entertainment. The title is yours by right," Edward persisted. "The marriage to your mother predated my parents' union. Under the law—" "The law," Thomas interrupted, pushing off from the counter. "The law is written by men with power to protect men with power. Do you think the House of Lords would simply accept a cartographer from Clerkenwell as the Duke of Ashford? They'd find a way to invalidate the claim, declare the marriage irregular, question my mother's virtue, produce some obscure statute. And even if by some miracle they didn't, what then? I step into a role I've never been trained for, managing an estate I know nothing about, navigating a society that would view me as an imposter." The words struck at Edward's own deepest fears. "I could help you," he offered, "teach you what you'd need to know." Thomas's expression softened slightly, something almost like pity crossing his features. "You seem like a decent man, Edward, genuinely. But this isn't a fairy tale where honor conquers all obstacles. Our father made choices that shaped 2 lives in utterly different directions. I've built something here, modest as it is. I have clients, a reputation, a life I understand. What you're offering is chaos." "What I'm offering is truth," Edward countered. "Don't you want to know the estate, the family history where you came from?" "I know where I came from," Thomas said quietly. "I came from a woman who loved a man who abandoned her, who raised me with stories of a father who was kind and brilliant and trapped by duty. She made excuses for him until the day she died, and I swore I'd never be like her, never let aristocratic promises mean more than reality." He picked up the letter, held it between them. "This is a dead man's guilt, Edward. It doesn't obligate either of us." Edward felt the ground shifting beneath him. He'd expected anger, demands, perhaps threats. Instead, he faced something more destabilizing: rejection. "So you'd let the injustice stand? Accept that you were cheated of your inheritance?" "I was cheated of a father," Thomas said. "The inheritance is just property, and property has ruined more lives than it's blessed in my experience." He moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. "Go back to Ashford Park, your grace. Marry your heiress, produce your heirs. Let this letter be what our father intended, a confession to ease his conscience in death, not a curse to poison your life." "I can't," Edward said. surprised by the conviction in his voice. "I've tried these past weeks to convince myself that keeping the secret was acceptable. But every time I sign a document as Duke, every time someone addresses me by the title, I feel like a thief. I can't build a life on that foundation." Thomas turned back to him, and for the first time, Edward saw genuine curiosity in his brother's expression. "Why do you care so much? You've been raised to this. It's not your fault our father lied." "Because it's wrong," Edward said simply, "and because I think you deserve to make the choice yourself, knowing the truth. Not what our father decided, not what I decide, but what you choose, with full knowledge of what's owed to you." They stood in silence, these two men bound by blood, but separated by every circumstance of birth and breeding. Finally, Thomas sighed. "I need time. This isn't a decision I can make in an evening, no matter how dramatic the revelation." He held out the letter. "May I keep this?" Edward nodded. "There's something else you should know. My cousin, Gerard, knows about the letter. I confided in him, and I believe he may be using the information against me." Thomas's eyes sharpened. "Using it how?" "Positioning himself as the estate's real power while I'm distracted, possibly sabotaging my search for you. If I were to step aside, Gerard would be next in line for the title. He has considerably more motivation than you to see this buried." "Wonderful," Thomas said dryly. "A cousin with ambitions. This gets better and better." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Edward's own nervous habit that it was startling. "Go home, Edward. Give me a week to think. I'll send word to Ashford Park, and for God's sake, don't tell anyone else about me. If your cousin is as ambitious as you suggest, the fewer people who know, the safer we both are." Edward wanted to argue, to press for immediate resolution, but he recognized the wisdom in waiting. He dropped a title and an estate in his brother's lap. The least he could do was give him time to process it. "1 week," he agreed. "But Thomas, thank you for listening, for not dismissing this outright." Thomas's expression remained guarded. "Don't thank me yet. You may wish I'd slammed the door in your face before this is done." The ride back to Hertfordshire felt longer than the journey to London. Edward's mind spun with possibilities and dangers. Thomas was right about the scandal, about the legal complexities, about society's likely reaction. But he was also, Edward realized, remarkably perceptive. He'd sized up the situation with the analytical precision of someone accustomed to charting courses through uncharted waters. Edward arrived at Ashford Park near midnight to find the house ablaze with lights and a cluster of carriages in the drive. His stomach sank. Something had happened in his absence, and judging by the scale of activity, it was significant. His butler, Simmons, met him in the entrance hall with barely concealed distress. "Your Grace, thank God you've returned. Lord Montrose is here, and Lady Clarissa and Edward." Gerard appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression a masterful blend of concern and reproach. "Where have you been? Lord Montrose has been waiting for hours. There's been a development." Edward climbed the stairs slowly, dread building with each step. The drawing room was packed with people, Montrose red-faced and angry, Clarissa looking pleased with herself, his mother pale and tight-lipped, and half a dozen society figures whose presence suggested this was more performance than private meeting. "Ashford," Montrose said the moment Edward entered, "I've come to demand an explanation. My daughter's reputation has been compromised by your inexplicable behavior, and I require satisfaction." "Compromised?" Edward stared at Clarissa, who met his gaze with a small, triumphant smile. "How?" "Your cousin has informed me," Montrose continued, "that you've been conducting secret investigations in London, meeting with questionable individuals in unsavoury neighbourhoods. Lady Pemberton saw you in Clerkenwell, of all places, entering a shop with covered windows. The implications are absurd," Edward interrupted, but his heart was racing. This was Gerard's move. Twist his search for Thomas into something scandalous, force his hand. "I was conducting private business, nothing that reflects on anyone's reputation." "Private business in Clerkenwell?" Lady Pemberton, a notorious gossip, spoke up from her chair. "Really, Your Grace, we're not children. If you have an attachment elsewhere, you owe Lord Montrose the courtesy of saying so plainly." The trap snapped shut around him. If he explained the truth, he'd expose Thomas prematurely, vulnerable to Gerard's machinations. If he remained silent, society would assume he had a mistress or worse. Either way, his reputation, already shaky, would be shredded. Edward's eyes found Gerard across the room. His cousin's expression was sympathetic, concerned, and beneath it, Edward finally saw the predator he'd been too trusting to recognize before. Gerard had orchestrated this perfectly. Force Edward into either a damaging admission or a marriage to Clarissa that would make any claim of Thomas's impossible to pursue. "The matter I was investigating," Edward said carefully, "concerns family business. Private family business that I'm not at liberty to discuss in present company." "Not good enough," Montrose said flatly. "Your evasiveness has exposed my daughter to speculation and gossip. The only way to silence the rumors is an immediate betrothal announcement. Otherwise, I'll be forced to conclude you're trifling with her affections and respond accordingly." It was a threat, barely disguised. Montrose had the wealth and connections to make Edward's life miserable, and Gerard had ensured there were enough witnesses to this confrontation that backing down would look like cowardice or guilt. Edward looked at his mother, hoping for support, but she avoided his eyes. She'd sided with Gerard, he realized, or perhaps she'd always been on his cousin's side, seeing in Gerard the strong heir she wished her son could be. "I need time," Edward said, the same plea he'd offered Montrose once before. "You've had time," Montrose snapped. "I need an answer tonight, Ashford. Will you do right by my daughter or not?" The room fell silent, every eye on Edward. He thought of Thomas, asking for a week to decide his future. Edward didn't have a week. He had seconds to choose between honor and survival, between the truth that could destroy him and the lie that would trap him forever. He began. The drawing-room door burst open. Every head turned as a messenger, mud spattered from hard riding, pushed past the protesting butler. "Urgent message for the Duke of Ashford," the man gasped. "From London, marked immediate." Edward took the sealed note with shaking hands. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and read the 5 words written there in Thomas's precise cartographer's hand. "I accept. We meet tomorrow." Everything changed in that moment. Edward looked up at the assembled company, at Gerard's calculating expression, at Montrose's impatient scowl, at Clarissa's confident smile. They thought they had him cornered. They thought he'd cave to pressure as he always had, choose the path of least resistance. But Thomas had made his choice, and now Edward had to make his. "Lord Montrose," Edward said, his voice steady for the first time that evening, "I cannot offer for your daughter. Not now, and truthfully, not ever. There are matters concerning the Ashford succession that must be resolved first, and until they are, I cannot in good conscience bind myself or anyone else to uncertain prospects." The room erupted. Montrose's face turned purple. Gerard's mask slipped, showing naked fury. Only his mother looked unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting Edward to fail this test. "You'll regret this," Montrose said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'll see to it personally." "Perhaps," Edward acknowledged, "but at least I'll have acted with honor." He walked out of his own drawing room, the messenger's note clutched in his fist, and didn't look back. Behind him, he could hear Gerard already working to control the damage, his smooth voice spinning explanations. But Edward no longer cared. Tomorrow he would meet with Thomas. Together they would navigate whatever came next. Scandal, legal battles, society's censure. For the first time since breaking his father's seal, Edward felt something like hope. Thomas Wright was not what London society expected, and that made him dangerous. When he arrived at Ashford Park the following afternoon, travelling third class on the railway and walking the last 3 miles from the station, Gerard Ashford realised immediately that his carefully laid plans would need revision. The mapmaker carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his place in the world rather than inherited it. And when he shook Edward's hand in the entrance hall, the physical resemblance between the brothers was undeniable enough to stop servants in their tracks. Gerard watched from the gallery above as Edward led Thomas to the study, the same room where the late Duke's confession had first come to light. He needed to hear what they planned, to understand the full scope of the threat. Gerard had spent 32 years as the heir presumptive after Edward, 3 steps from a dukedom he'd been groomed to assume. He'd borrowed heavily against those expectations, made promises to powerful men based on future influence. If this common-born bastard, no, even worse, if this legitimate elder son displaced them both, Gerard would be left with nothing but debts and humiliation. He descended the stairs with purpose, knocked once on the study door, and entered without waiting for permission. "Gerard," Edward said, his tone cold, "this is a private conversation." "Not anymore." Gerard closed the door behind him. "If you're discussing the succession of Ashford, I have every right to be present, third in line after all. Or would be, if the line were legitimate." He turned his attention to Thomas, assessing him like a potential buyer examining livestock. "So you're the skeleton from the late Duke's closet. I must say, you wear it well. And you must be the ambitious cousin," Thomas replied evenly. "Edward warned me about you." Gerard smiled without warmth. "I prefer realistic to ambitious. Unlike our idealistic young Duke here, I understand how the world actually works." He poured himself brandy uninvited, settling into a chair. "So let's speak plainly, Mr. Wright. What's your price?" "Gerard," Edward started, but Thomas held up a hand. "Let him talk," Thomas said. "I'm curious what he thinks I want." "Money, obviously," Gerard said. "Every man has a price, and you'd be a fool not to capitalize on this situation. The question is simply how much? £10,000? 20? Enough to expand your little shop into a proper business, set yourself up comfortably. In exchange, you sign a document disclaiming any interest in the title. We destroy that inconvenient letter, and everyone moves forward with the status quo intact. Except that the status quo is built on a lie," Thomas observed. "All great families are built on lies," Gerard countered. "The trick is knowing which ones to maintain and which to discard. This one should stay buried. Edward inherits, produces heirs with a suitable wife. Not Montrose's daughter, clearly, but someone, and the Ashford line continues unblemished. You get compensated for your discretion. I continue advising the estate, and we all avoid a scandal that would entertain the gossips for years while destroying 3 lives." Edward looked appalled. "You can't seriously be suggesting we bribe him to abandon his legitimate claim." "I'm suggesting we negotiate like rational adults rather than posturing like characters in a melodrama," Gerard snapped. "Mr. Wright is a businessman. He understands transactions. Don't you, Mr. Wright?" Thomas stood and walked to the windows overlooking Ashford Park's gardens, acres of manicured landscape stretching toward ornamental lakes and ancient oaks. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "My mother used to tell me about it. She visited once before the marriage was annulled, when the old Duke was still alive. She said it looked like something from a painting, a place where nothing bad could happen." "Thomas," Edward began, but his brother continued. "She was wrong, of course. Bad things happen everywhere, regardless of how lovely the setting." Thomas turned back to face them. "You want to know my price, Lord Gerard? Here it is. I want my brother to make his own choice, free from your manipulation. I want the truth, all of it, put before proper legal counsel to determine what the law actually says, not what powerful men wish it said. And I want to see the estate records, understand what Edward would be giving up before anyone makes permanent decisions." "That's not a price, that's a list of demands," Gerard said flatly. "Then meet them or don't." Thomas's expression hardened. "But understand this. I spent my childhood wondering why my father never visited, why we lived in poverty while he resided in palaces. My mother made excuses, said he loved us but couldn't acknowledge us. I believed her because the alternative, that he simply didn't care enough, was unbearable. Then she died, and I learned to live without the fantasy. I built a life that doesn't require aristocratic validation. So if you think you can buy my silence or intimidate me into disappearing, you've misjudged badly. I don't need Ashford Park, but if there's a legal case that it belongs to me, I won't be cheated of it through backroom deals and bribery. The study fell silent. Gerard's face had gone dangerously still, the affable mask completely dropped. You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Wright. The law is a weapon the powerful wield against the weak. If you pursue this claim, I'll ensure every resource of this family goes toward crushing it. We'll drag your mother's name through the courts, question her virtue, suggest the marriage was invalid for a dozen obscure technical reasons. We'll paint you as an opportunistic fraud, exploiting a dead man's confusion. And we'll win, because we have centuries of precedent and infinite resources on our side. Gerard, enough! Edward stepped between them. Get out, now! This is my family too, Gerard said, not moving. I won't stand by while you hand our legacy to a stranger based on one letter from a guilt-ridden old man. He's not a stranger, he's our brother, Edward said. And unlike you, he's not grasping at what isn't his. If anything, I'm the one who what? Who deserves to lose everything because of misplaced nobility? Gerard laughed harshly. Wake up, Edward. You've been Duke for 6 months, and already the estate is suffering. The tenants see your weakness, the managers ignore your orders, and your peers view you as a temporary embarrassment. Now you want to add illegitimacy to incompetence. The lords will never accept right, which means the title will pass to me, something I'm starting to think might be best for everyone. The threat hung in the air, naked and undeniable. Gerard wasn't just protecting his position, he was positioning himself to seize it entirely. If Edward's legitimacy was questioned and Thomas's claim failed, Gerard would be the last man standing. Get out, Edward repeated, his voice low and final. You're no longer welcome in this house. Gerard stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs with deliberate calm. You'll regret this decision, cousin. Both of you. He looked at Thomas. Enjoy your tour of the estate, Mr. Wright. Memorize it well. It's the closest you'll ever get to owning it. He left, closing the door with exaggerated care, leaving the two brothers alone. Edward sagged against the desk. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how far he'd fallen into protecting his interests, Thomas finished. Don't apologize for him. At least he's honest about his motives. He came to stand beside Edward, looking at the portrait of their father above the fireplace, the late Duke in his prime, painted 20 years ago, looking every inch the aristocratic ideal. Do I look like him? Edward studied the painting, then his brother, around the eyes, the set of the jaw. But you look more like yourself than him, if that makes sense. More than I wish I did, Thomas admitted. I spent years resenting him. Then more years trying not to care. Now I'm standing in his house, contemplating becoming him, and I don't know what I feel. He turned to Edward. Your cousin was right about one thing. I am a businessman, so let me be blunt. I don't want to be Duke. The life, the responsibilities, the artifice of it all, it's not who I am. But I also won't let your family erase my mother's memory or pretend I don't exist to preserve convenient lies. Then what do you want? Edward asked. Not what Gerard offered, not what I'm proposing. What would make this right for you? Thomas thought for a long moment. Recognition, he finally said, not the title necessarily, but acknowledgement. I want the record to show that Catherine Wright was legally married to the Duke of Ashford, that she wasn't his mistress or a youthful mistake, but his legitimate wife, and I want the estate to understand what happened. Not a scandal to be whispered about, but the truth, stated plainly. My mother deserves that much. And the title, Edward pressed. If the law says it's yours, then we'll deal with that when we know, Thomas said. But Edward, I've watched you these past 2 days. You're a good man, maybe too good for the role you've inherited. But you're learning, and you care about doing right. If the law gives us options, choices beyond all or nothing, I'd rather find a solution where you keep Ashford and I keep my dignity. Is that possible? Edward felt something loosen in his chest. I don't know, but I'd like to try. Will you stay? Not as a claimant or a threat, but as my brother. Help me understand what our father did, what we've both inherited. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. A week. I'll stay a week. Learn about the estate, meet with solicitors. Then I need to return to London. I have a business to run, clients depending on me. But yes, I'll stay. Fair warning, though. If Gerard is representative of your social circle, I'm going to be terrible at aristocratic politeness. Edward laughed, surprising himself. Good. I could use some honest company. Over the following days, Thomas Wright became a fixture at Ashford Park, and his presence transformed the estate's atmosphere. The servants, initially scandalized, found themselves charmed by the Duke's previously unknown brother, who asked their names, inquired about their work, and treated them like people rather than furniture. The estate managers, summoned to explain various operations, discovered that Thomas's questions, drawn from his experience running a business, were uncomfortably perceptive. You're hemorrhaging money on these leases, Thomas said, reviewing the agricultural contracts. The terms are too favorable to the tenants, and there's no escalation clause for good years. It's generous, but it's also unsustainable. My father believed in protecting his tenants, Edward said defensively. There's protecting and there's enabling dependency, Thomas countered. These families could pay fair rents and still thrive. By undercharging, you're preventing yourself from making necessary improvements to the estate, which will hurt everyone long term. It's bad business disguised as charity. Edward bristled at first, but as Thomas walked him through the numbers, his mapmaker's precision applied to ledgers and yields, he began to see the patterns he'd missed. His father's generosity had indeed been part benevolence, part avoidance. Rather than make hard decisions, the late Duke had simply absorbed costs, leaving Edward with an estate mortgaged to sentiment. You'd make a better Duke than I would, Edward said one evening as they reviewed documents in the study. Thomas shook his head. I'd make a terrible Duke. I lack the patience for protocol and the stomach for the social games your cousin plays. But I'd make a decent steward or land agent if such a thing were possible for an illegitimate brother. He paused. Or legitimate elder son whose claim is inconvenient. The terminology gets confusing. We need the legal opinion, Edward said. I've sent for Sir Reginald Hawthorne. He's supposed to be the finest solicitor in London for inheritance law. Sir Reginald arrived 3 days later, a wizened man of 70 with shrewd eyes and a reputation for integrity. Edward and Thomas laid out the entire situation, the letter, the dates, the annulment, everything. Sir Reginald listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression inscrutable. Remarkable, he said when they finished, and remarkably complicated. The central question is whether the annulment of the marriage to Catherine Wright was legally sound. If it was not, if the marriage was valid at the time of Thomas's birth, then he is indeed the legitimate eldest son and rightful heir. However, he held up a warning finger. The annulment was processed through ecclesiastical courts, which had jurisdiction over marriage at the time. Challenging it now, 26 years later, would be extraordinary. The courts are deeply reluctant to overturn settled matters, especially when significant property interests are involved. So Thomas's claim would fail? Edward asked. I didn't say that, Sir Reginald corrected. I said it would be difficult. The marriage was valid when contracted. The annulment's grounds would need examination. Was it based on coercion, misrepresentation? What? And there's the question of the late Duke's acknowledgement in the letter. That's powerful evidence of his own belief in Thomas's legitimacy. But would the Lords accept it? Thomas interjected. Be honest, Sir Reginald. Would Parliament seat a mapmaker from Clerkenwell as the Duke of Ashford? The old solicitor smiled thinly. Ah, now that's the political question underneath the legal one. Truthfully, it would be a battle. Precedent is mixed. There have been cases of disputed successions resolved in favor of elder sons, even when irregularities existed, but there have also been cases where the lords chose pragmatism over strict legal right, particularly when the claimant lacked aristocratic training. So we could fight for years and still lose, Thomas said, or win and find the victory hollow. Sir Reginald agreed. The legal community would be divided, the lords suspicious, society scandalized. You'd be the controversial duke, Edward the dispossessed brother, and Gerard, if I understand correctly, lurking in the wings, hoping you destroy each other. He set down his notes. May I offer an alternative path? Both brothers leaned forward. Please, Edward said. Legitimization without displacement, Sir Reginald said. Thomas is acknowledged as the late Duke's legitimate son, not bastardized, not erased, but recognized. We publicly document the marriage to Catherine Wright, validate his birth, but argue that the annulment, however questionable, created a legal circumstance where Edward's claim took precedence through his mother's subsequent marriage. It's not perfect legally, but it's defensible. And it could be structured as a family agreement rather than a lawsuit, which would minimize scandal. That still leaves Thomas with nothing, Edward protested. Not nothing, Sir Reginald said. Under such an arrangement, Thomas would be legally recognized as Lord Thomas Ashford, son of the Duke. He'd have family standing, potentially a seat in Commons if he chose it, and Edward could settle property on him. A smaller estate, an income, whatever they agreed was fair compensation. Thomas sat back, processing. I'd be acknowledged but subordinated, legitimized but not restored. Yes, Sir Reginald confirmed. It's a compromise. Edward keeps Ashford, but with the burden of supporting his brother and publicly recognizing the family's past wrong. You gain recognition and security, but not the title. It won't satisfy purists on either side, but it might satisfy justice, at least enough to let you both move forward. What do you think? Edward asked Thomas. Thomas stood and walked to the window, his habitual spot for thinking, Edward had learned. I think, he said slowly, that my mother would have wept with gratitude to hear me called Lord Thomas Ashford, son of the Duke, that the acknowledgement alone would have meant everything to her. He turned back. And I think Gerard will fight this tooth and nail, because even legitimized I'd be a barrier to his ambitions. Let him fight, Edward said with sudden fierceness. This is right, Thomas. Not perfect, but right. Will you accept it? On one condition, Thomas said. If we do this, if I'm to become Lord Thomas and play at being aristocracy, you help me run the estate properly. Use these skills you say I have. Let me be more than an expensive recognition of guilt. Make me actually useful. Edward crossed to his brother and extended his hand. Partners, he said. Brothers and partners. Thomas gripped his hand. God help us both, he said with a slight smile. This is going to be spectacular disaster or surprising success, and I can't tell which. Perhaps both, Sir Reginald observed dryly. In my experience, most family arrangements are. The plan was set. Sir Reginald would draw up the documents, structure the legal recognition, and prepare for Gerard's inevitable opposition. Edward would begin transferring a minor estate in Derbyshire to Thomas's name. Thornfield Manor, modest by ducal standards, but substantial enough to provide independence. And they would make the announcement at the Winter Assembly, forcing Gerard to react publicly where society's pressure might restrain his worst impulses. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, Edward felt the weight of impending battle. Gerard wouldn't accept this quietly, and neither would society. The easy path would have been silence, burn the letter, pay Thomas off, continue the comfortable lie. But as Edward watched his brother study the maps of Thornfield Manor with professional interest, sketching possible improvements in the margins, he knew they'd made the only choice they could live with. Not the expedient choice, but the right one. Edward, Thomas said without looking up from the maps. Thank you for finding me, for choosing this. Thank my father, Edward said. His letter set this in motion. No, Thomas looked up, his expression serious. Your father wrote the letter. You acted on it. That's the difference between guilt and honor, and it's why I think this might actually work. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Ashford Park's ancient oaks. Inside, two brothers prepared for the tempest to come. Gerard Ashford received his invitation to the winter assembly with barely concealed fury. The timing was unmistakable. Edward was forcing a confrontation on ground of his choosing, with witnesses that would constrain everyone's behavior. Gerard crumpled the embossed card in his fist, then smoothed it out again. If Edward wanted theatre, Gerard would give him a performance society would never forget. The assembly was traditionally Ashford Park's grandest social event, drawing the cream of Hertfordshire and London society to mark the season. Edward had maintained the tradition, despite his mourning period technically continuing, which itself raised eyebrows. But when word spread that an announcement of family significance would be made, speculation reached fever pitch. Was the young Duke finally betrothing himself? Had he resolved the mysterious scandal that had cost him the Montrose alliance? Carriages began arriving at dusk on a frigid December evening. The manor blazed with light from every window, the great hall decorated with holly and evergreen boughs, the ballroom prepared for dancing. Edward stood in the receiving line beside his mother, the Dowager Duchess, her expression glacial. She had opposed this entire scheme, calling it theatrical foolishness, but Edward had overridden her objections. Tonight, Thomas would be introduced to society, and the truth, or a carefully edited version, would emerge. Thomas himself was somewhere in the East Wing, being dressed by Edward's valet in formal attire, borrowed and altered to fit his broader frame. He'd protested the entire proceeding, arguing that simply filing legal documents would suffice, but Sir Reginald had been firm. Society required ritual. Without a public acknowledgement, rumours would fester. The assembly provided a controlled environment where the family's narrative could be established before gossip filled the vacuum with something worse. Gerard arrived fashionably late, accompanied by Lord and Lady Pemberton, the latter still avidly interested in any scandal involving the Duke. He bowed to Edward with exaggerated courtesy, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Cousin, what a delightful surprise, this sudden urge for entertainment. I'd heard you'd become quite the recluse." "Family is never a reclusion, Gerard," Edward replied evenly. "You'll understand shortly." Gerard's eyes narrowed, but he moved into the ballroom before pressing further. Edward watched him work the room. A word here, a meaningful pause there, laying groundwork for something. Whatever Gerard planned, it would come tonight. Sir Reginald had warned that Gerard might try to preempt their announcement with his own narrative, possibly even challenge Edward's competence publicly to trigger a family review of the succession. At 9 o'clock, with the assembly in full swing and society's attention focused on the ballroom, Edward mounted the musicians' platform and called for silence. The music ceased. 300 faces turned toward him, curious, judging, eager for whatever entertainment the awkward young Duke would provide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward began, his voice steadier than he felt, "thank you for joining the Ashford family tonight. As many of you know, this has been a year of profound change and difficulty. My father's death left many matters unresolved." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Chief among them was a private family matter that honor compels me to address publicly." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gerard shifted position, preparing to interrupt if needed. But Edward pressed on. "Before his death, my father left a letter revealing a truth he had concealed for 26 years. Prior to his marriage to my mother, before he inherited the dukedom, my father contracted a legal marriage to a woman named Catherine Wright. That marriage was subsequently annulled, but not before a son was born. That son is my brother, legitimate in birth and blood, and it is time he was recognized as such." The murmurs exploded into shocked conversation. Edward raised his hand for silence. "I know this is highly irregular, but justice delayed is not justice denied, and my brother deserves acknowledgement. I present to you Thomas Wright, son of the late Duke of Ashford, and my elder brother." The ballroom doors opened. Thomas entered, looking profoundly uncomfortable in formal evening dress, but carrying himself with quiet dignity. The physical resemblance to Edward was striking enough that even skeptics paused. Thomas crossed the ballroom floor, that long walk through society's gauntlet, and mounted the platform beside Edward. "Good evening," Thomas said simply, his voice lacking aristocratic polish but carrying sincerity. "I'm aware this is unexpected and possibly unwelcome to some. I have no intention of disrupting the social order or claiming what I wasn't raised to. I appear tonight simply to be seen and acknowledged, to restore my mother's honor and accept whatever place the family offers. I hope, in time, to earn your respect as I have earned my living, through honest work and decent conduct." It was a good speech, Sir Reginald's influence evident in its structure. But Gerard chose that moment to strike. "How touching!" Gerard called from the ballroom floor, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "A bastard with aspirations. Tell me, Mr. Wright, or should we say Lord Thomas, now that Edward's knighted you with pretensions, what exactly do you do for a living?" "I'm a cartographer," Thomas replied without embarrassment. "I make maps for merchant vessels and explorers." "Maps?" Gerard laughed, and several sycophants echoed him. "How wonderfully common. And we're to believe that a man who draws pictures for sailors is the legitimate son of a duke." He turned to address the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing either extraordinary generosity or extraordinary gullibility. Our dear Duke Edward, in his innocence, has been taken in by a clever fraud. This brother produces a convenient letter, claims a marriage no one can verify." "The marriage is verified," Edward interrupted coldly. "Sir Reginald Hawthorne has examined all documentation and confirmed its validity." "Sir Reginald is an old man whose reputation rests on discretion, not scrutiny," Gerard countered. "Of course he'll support whatever story brings him fees. But consider the timing, cousin. You're young, unmarried, recently humiliated by the Montrose affair. Along comes a sympathetic figure who resembles you enough to be plausible, spins a tale of noble birth denied, and you, desperate for family, for connection, embrace him without question. It's touching, really, also dangerously naive." Thomas's jaw tightened, but Edward stepped forward. "You're suggesting I'm incapable of verifying my own brother's identity? That I'd make this announcement on whim?" "I'm suggesting you're lonely and susceptible," Gerard said, his voice softening into false concern. "You've been isolated, struggling with responsibilities beyond your preparation. This man offered you companionship and purpose, and you accepted without proper investigation. It's understandable, Edward. But it's also potentially devastating to the family's reputation and legal standing." It was masterfully done. Gerard wasn't attacking Thomas directly. He was framing Edward as the victim, too weak and desperate to see through an obvious con. Several heads nodded around the ballroom. The narrative was taking hold. Sir Reginald stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the platform. "If I may address Lord Gerard's concerns," the old solicitor said, his voice carrying surprising force. "I have examined parish records, ecclesiastical court documents, and sworn testimonies. The marriage between the late Duke and Catherine Wright was legal and witnessed. The annulment was procedurally valid, but does not invalidate Thomas's legitimacy at birth. These are matters of record, not speculation. Records can be falsified," Gerard shot back, "especially old ones, conveniently discovered after all principals are dead." "Are you accusing me of fraud, Lord Gerard?" Sir Reginald's tone went arctic. "Because I assure you, my reputation will withstand scrutiny better than your insinuations." The confrontation was escalating beyond social bounds. People pressed closer, eager not to miss a word. Edward saw the evening spiraling away from the controlled revelation they'd planned. He needed to regain narrative control. "Enough," Edward said sharply. "Gerard, your objections are noted. If you wish to challenge Thomas's legitimacy legally, you're welcome to do so through proper channels. But tonight is not a courtroom, and these guests are not judges. Thomas is my brother. I'm settling Thornfield Manor on him and recognizing him as family. That's my decision as Duke, and it's final." "Your decision as Duke," Gerard repeated, seizing on the phrase. "There's the heart of it, isn't it? As long as you remain Duke." "But Edward, this announcement raises serious questions about your judgment. First, you alienate the Montrose alliance without explanation. Then you produce a convenient brother with convenient claims. Now you're giving away family property to legitimize this arrangement." He turned to the assembly. "I call for a family council. The succession needs review, and Edward's capacity to manage the estate should be formally assessed." A collective gasp went through the room. A family council was a nuclear option. It could result in a duke being declared incompetent, his authority transferred to trustees. It was humiliating, destructive, and exactly what Gerard wanted. "You can't be serious," Edward said, shocked at the audacity. "I'm deadly serious," Gerard replied, "and I'm not alone in my concerns. Your Grace, you've been Duke for 6 months, and in that time you've destabilized every alliance your father built. You've shown questionable judgment, made decisions without consulting family, and now produced a mysterious brother to justify transferring assets. If you're having some sort of breakdown, we need to address it before the damage becomes irreparable." It was character assassination, disguised as concern, and it was working. Edward could see doubt blooming on faces around the room. His hands clenched at his sides, fury and helplessness warring inside him. Then Thomas spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lord Gerard, I have a question." Gerard turned to him with a patronizing smile. "Yes, Mr. Wright? You've suggested I'm a fraud, that I've somehow fabricated my identity to exploit your cousin's loneliness. But you haven't asked me any verifiable questions. You haven't tested my knowledge. So let me offer something concrete. I can tell you details about my mother that only someone who knew her could know. I can describe the late Duke's habits and appearance from her accounts. I can show you this." Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, gold, set with a small sapphire. "My mother's wedding ring, given to her by the late Duke on their marriage day. Inside there's an inscription. Would you care to read it, Your Grace?" Edward took the ring with trembling hands. He'd seen his father wear a ring like this, always on his right hand, until it disappeared sometime in Edward's childhood. He held it to the light, reading the inscription engraved in the gold. C.W. Eternal, R.A. Catherine Wright, and the late Duke's given name, Richard. His father's secret marriage, literally worn on his hand for years. The ballroom fell silent. Edward handed the ring to Sir Reginald for examination, but the gesture was unnecessary. He could see in his cousin's face that Gerard recognized the ring too, had perhaps wondered years ago where it had gone, what it meant. "This proves nothing," Gerard said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "A ring could be anyone's. It proves more than your baseless accusations," Sir Reginald said quietly. "The engraving dates the piece to approximately 1798, consistent with the marriage date. And I rather doubt Mr. Wright orchestrated a fraud detailed enough to include commissioning period jewelry with the late Duke's initials." The assembly's mood shifted. Thomas's simple gesture, producing a concrete piece of evidence, had done more to validate his claim than any speech could. He wasn't claiming grand things or demanding title. He was simply showing, with quiet proof, that he was exactly who he said. Gerard saw his advantage slipping. "Very well," he said, his voice hardening. "The ring suggests a relationship existed, but that still doesn't justify Edward giving away family property or making unilateral decisions about succession. I maintain that a family council is warranted." "Then call it," a voice said from near the entrance. Every head turned. Lady Agatha Tremaine, the late Duke's eldest sister and undisputed matriarch of the extended Ashford family, stood in the doorway. She was 73, formidable despite her years, and had spent decades in semi-retirement on her estate in Derbyshire. Her presence at Ashford Park was unexpected. Edward hadn't even known she'd been invited. Aunt Agatha, Gerard said, recovering quickly. "Thank goodness. Perhaps you can talk sense into—" "Be silent, Gerard," Lady Agatha said crisply. She walked into the ballroom with a cane she didn't need, using it for emphasis. Society parted before her like the Red Sea. She mounted the platform, studied Thomas for a long moment, then turned to the assembly. "My brother Richard was many things," she said. "A dutiful son, a capable duke, and a coward in matters of the heart. I knew about Catherine Wright. Not all the details, but enough. I knew he'd loved someone before Helena, and I knew it had ended badly. I'd suspected there might be a child, but Richard never spoke of it, and I respected his silence." She looked at Thomas. "You have his eyes. And his hands. See how the fingers taper. That's pure Ashford." She turned to Gerard. "As for you, nephew, your ambition has always exceeded your wisdom. Edward is duke by law and fact. If he chooses to acknowledge his brother and settle property on him, that's his prerogative. I support it fully." "Aunt, you can't possibly—" Gerard began. "I can, and I do," Lady Agatha interrupted. "Furthermore, I move that if any family council is convened, it should examine Gerard's financial arrangements. I've heard interesting things about debts incurred against your expectations of inheriting. Perhaps we should scrutinize your judgment before questioning Edward's." Gerard's face went white. The threat was clear. Push this further, and Lady Agatha would expose whatever financial maneuvering he'd engaged in. The old woman had resources and information Gerard couldn't match. The standoff held for a breathless moment. Then Gerard bowed stiffly. "As you wish, Aunt Agatha. I withdraw my call for a council, for now, but I maintain my objections to this entire affair." He looked at Edward and Thomas. "This isn't over, cousins, not by a long measure." He strode from the ballroom, a small coterie of supporters following. The assembly dissolved into frantic conversation. Lady Agatha took Edward's arm, gesturing for Thomas to join them. "Well," she said with grim satisfaction, "that was more exciting than I'd anticipated. Thomas, is it? Come, let's get away from these vultures and talk properly. You too, Edward. We have family business to discuss. Real family business, not Gerard's theatrics." As they left the ballroom, Edward felt Thomas's hand briefly grip his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and gratitude. Behind them, society dissected the evening's events with gleeful intensity. Ahead, Lady Agatha led them to the quiet of the study, where truth could finally be spoken without performance. The battle wasn't won, but they'd survived the opening salvo, and for tonight that was enough. 8 months later, Thornfield Manor in Derbyshire bloomed with early summer. The estate, modest by ducal standards but substantial enough to employ 40 souls and encompass 3 villages, had undergone a remarkable transformation under Thomas's stewardship. The former mapmaker approached land management with the same precision he'd applied to charting trade routes, identifying inefficiencies, optimizing yields, and establishing relationships with tenants based on mutual respect rather than feudal hierarchy. Edward visited on a Friday afternoon in June, riding up the tree-lined drive to find his brother in shirt sleeves, supervising the construction of new cottages for estate workers. Thomas had argued that modern housing increased productivity and loyalty, a practical investment rather than charity. The results proved him right. Thornfield's accounts showed modest profits for the first time in a decade. "Your Grace," Thomas called, wiping sweat from his forehead. He still refused to use Edward's Christian name in company, maintaining propriety despite their growing friendship. "You're early. I'm not even presentable." "You're working," Edward replied, dismounting. "That's respectable enough." He studied the construction with interest. Father would have called this extravagant. "Father let good workers live in structures that collapsed in winter," Thomas said bluntly. "Penny wise and pound foolish. These cottages will last 50 years and keep families healthy enough to work. It's practical economics." They walked toward the manor house, a Queen Anne structure built in warm, honey-coloured stone, graceful without being ostentatious. Thomas had been living there for 5 months, initially overwhelmed by the sheer scale of managing an estate, but growing into the role with surprising aptitude. Sir Reginald had structured the settlement carefully. Thornfield was Thomas's for life, with reversion to Edward's heirs thereafter, ensuring the property remained within the family while granting Thomas genuine autonomy. "How's Ashford?" Thomas asked as they settled in the library with cold drinks. The room reflected Thomas's personality. Maps covered one wall, books on agriculture and engineering filled the shelves, a drafting table stood near the windows where he still occasionally took commissions for cartography work. "Stable," Edward said. "The harvest looks good, and I've implemented several of your suggestions about the southern leases. Gerard has been quiet." "Too quiet?" Thomas asked shrewdly. "Probably," Edward admitted. "Lady Agatha says he's been spending time in London, meeting with solicitors. She suspects he's still looking for legal avenues to challenge your legitimization or my competency. But without proof of fraud or incapacity, there's little he can do except wait for me to fail spectacularly." "Which you won't," Thomas said with more confidence than Edward felt. "You've improved considerably, brother. The difference between the uncertain young man I met last autumn and the Duke you've become is remarkable." It was true, though Edward credited much of his growth to Thomas's influence. Having a brother, someone who understood the weight but wasn't consumed by aristocratic pretension, had given Edward both confidence and perspective. They developed a partnership where Thomas's practical business sense balanced Edward's conscientiousness, creating an informal advisory relationship that benefited both estates. "There's something I need to tell you," Edward said, setting down his glass. "I've received a proposal of marriage." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Not the Montrose girl again?" "God, no. Lady Caroline Hastings. You met her at the assembly. Dark hair, intelligent eyes, asked you 36 questions about cartography." Thomas smiled. "I remember her. She was genuinely interested, not just making polite conversation." "Good family?" "Impeccable. Daughter of the Earl of Westmoreland, well-educated, independently minded. Her father's fortune comes from investments rather than inheritance, which means she understands money as something earned, not just possessed." Edward paused. "I think I might love her, Thomas, or at least I could learn to. She's different, real." "Then what's the hesitation?" Thomas asked. "Gerard opposed the match," Edward said. "Claimed the Hastings family was too liberal, that Caroline was unsuitable because she has opinions and isn't afraid to voice them. My mother, unsurprisingly, agrees with him. So naturally you should refuse her to please Gerard," Thomas said dryly. "That's worked well historically." Edward laughed. "Point taken. I'm accepting. I wanted you to hear it from me first, and to ask if you'd stand with me at the wedding. As my brother." Thomas's expression softened. "You're certain? Having me prominently placed will remind everyone of the scandal. Society hasn't forgotten, even if they've mostly accepted the situation." "I'm certain," Edward said firmly. "You're my brother. I'm not hiding that to appease people who'd prefer the truth stayed buried." "Then I'm honored," Thomas said quietly, "and grateful. When I walked into that assembly last December, I expected humiliation. Instead, I gained a family. That's worth more than any title." They sat in companionable silence, broken by a knock at the library door. Mrs. Brennan, Thornfield's housekeeper, entered with a calling card on a silver tray. "Lord Thomas, you have a visitor, a Miss Sarah Fletcher from the village. She says it's regarding the school proposal." Thomas's face lit up with interest. "Show her to the drawing room, Mrs. Brennan." "I'll be there directly." He turned to Edward. "Sarah Fletcher is a vicar's daughter, remarkably intelligent, passionate about education reform. She's been trying to establish a proper school in the village. Not just Sunday lessons, but real education for children who'd otherwise go straight into fieldwork. I've been helping with the planning." "Helping?" Edward asked with a knowing smile. "Is that what we're calling it?" Thomas flushed slightly. "She's a colleague in a civic project. Don't make it into something it isn't. Brother, I've seen you command estate managers and negotiate with grain merchants without a hint of colour in your cheeks. But mention Miss Fletcher, and you turn pink as a rose. It's charming, really. I'm not discussing this, Thomas said with dignity, standing. Stay for dinner. I'd value your opinion on her school proposal. It's ambitious but sound. Edward agreed, and over the following hours got to observe his brother with Sarah Fletcher, a petite woman with auburn hair and a mind like a steel trap, who argued education policy with Thomas with the same passion he brought to estate management. The affection between them was evident in every exchanged glance and unconscious smile, though both maintained proper formality in Edward's presence. "She's lovely," Edward said later after Miss Fletcher had departed with Thomas's promise to review her cost proposals. "And clearly brilliant." "She is," Thomas agreed. "She's also entirely unsuitable for me by society's standards. Vicar's daughter, no fortune, no connections. If I court her, it will be interpreted as proof that I don't belong in this world, that I'm still fundamentally common, despite the title." "Do you care?" Edward asked. Thomas thought for a moment. 6 months ago, I would have said no. But now, with Thornfield thriving and people depending on me, I wonder if pursuing a personal happiness might damage everything we've built. Gerard would use it as ammunition, claim I'm not truly reformed aristocracy, but just a pretender playing at nobility. "Gerard will find ammunition regardless," Edward said. "The question is whether you'll let his ambitions dictate your life. I spent months doing that, and it nearly destroyed me." "How did you break free?" Thomas asked. "I found something more important than his approval," Edward said simply. "You, the truth, my own integrity, and now Caroline. When you have something worth fighting for, other people's opinions lose their power." Thomas stared into the empty fireplace. "My mother used to say that love was the only aristocracy that mattered, that our father was noble, not because of his title, but because he'd loved her, however briefly. I used to think it was just her way of coping with abandonment, but maybe she understood something I'm only beginning to learn, which is that being legitimate, truly legitimate, not just legally, means living authentically," Thomas said. "I spent years resenting what I'd been denied, but the title, the property, even the recognition, none of it matters as much as being able to choose my own life honestly. If I let society's expectations trap me into loneliness, I'm just repeating our father's mistake in a different key." Edward gripped his brother's shoulder. "Then don't repeat it. Court Miss Fletcher. If she makes you happy, and you her, the rest is just noise." 3 months later, in September, Ashford Park hosted 2 weddings in succession. Edward married Lady Caroline Hastings in a ceremony that filled the estate church to capacity, with Thomas standing as his groomsman and Caroline's 3 sisters as attendants. The new Duchess proved immediately popular, charming tenants and society alike, with her genuine interest in estate affairs and her obvious affection for her husband. A week later, in a smaller ceremony at Thornfield's village church, Thomas married Sarah Fletcher. Edward gave the bride away, since her father had passed years before. The wedding was modest compared to ducal standards, but the joy was unmistakable. Sarah's vision for the village school would move forward with Thomas's full support, creating an educational model that other estates would eventually emulate. Gerard attended neither wedding. He'd retreated to his own small estate in Kent, his hopes of inheriting the dukedom definitively dashed by Edward's marriage and the clear possibility of heirs. Lady Agatha reported that he'd become something of a recluse, bitter and increasingly isolated. Edward felt a pang of pity for his cousin. Gerard had spent his life pursuing a future that was never truly his, and the loss had broken something essential inside him. "Do you think he'll try something again?" Caroline asked one evening as she and Edward walked the grounds of Ashford Park. She was already proving an insightful partner, her questions sharpening Edward's thinking about both estate management and family politics. "I don't know," Edward admitted. I hope he finds peace with what he has rather than resenting what he doesn't. But ambition like Gerard's doesn't usually fade quietly. Then we'll deal with it together, Caroline said, taking his arm. You, me, Thomas, Sarah, family isn't just blood, Edward. It's choosing to stand with people through complications. She was right. The family Edward had built, or rather rebuilt, from the ruins of his father's secrets, was stronger for being chosen rather than merely inherited. Thomas had become not just a brother, but a true partner, managing Thornfield with skill while advising on Ashford's affairs. Sarah brought education reform and social conscience to their efforts. Caroline provided the political sophistication and emotional intelligence Edward had always lacked. A year after the assembly, where Thomas had first been revealed, Edward stood in his study reading correspondence. One letter bore Thomas's seal, a report on Thornfield's harvest yields, and a note about Sarah's school successfully opening, enrolling 40 children, including tenants' daughters as well as sons. Another letter came from Lady Agatha, reporting that Gerard had finally sold his Kent estate and moved to America, seeking a fresh start where his name wasn't synonymous with failed ambition. Is that regret? Caroline asked, reading over his shoulder. Relief mostly, Edward said, and sadness. Gerard could have been an asset to the family if he'd chosen differently. Instead, his hunger for what wasn't his consumed him. While you gained a brother by acknowledging what was rightfully his, Caroline observed, there's a lesson there about the difference between taking and giving. Edward pulled her close, grateful for her wisdom and warmth. My father wrote that letter, hoping I'd have the courage he lacked. I don't know if I've lived up to that hope, but I've tried. You've done more than try, Caroline said softly. You've created something better than restoration of rights. You've built an actual family, chosen and real. That's rarer than you think even, especially among the aristocracy. She was right. The previous duke had tried to bury truth under duty and convention, fracturing his family in the process. Edward had chosen differently, accepting scandal and challenge to make things right. The cost had been real: social complications, legal expenses, Gerard's enmity, his mother's lingering disapproval. But the rewards were immeasurable. That evening, Thomas and Sarah arrived for dinner, bringing news that Sarah was expecting their first child. The celebration extended late into the night, 4 people bound by choice and conviction rather than mere obligation. As Edward watched his brother, Lord Thomas Ashford, legitimized son of the Duke, landowner, educator, soon-to-be father, he thought of the young man who'd entered this house a year ago, defensive and uncertain. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, catching his brother's contemplative expression. "That father's letter was meant as confession," Edward said, "but it became something better. A gift, maybe. The chance to choose the family we wanted to be, rather than the one we inherited." Thomas raised his glass. "To choices, then, and to brothers brave enough to make them. To family," Caroline added, her hand resting on Edward's. "However complicated. To truth," Sarah contributed, "even when it's inconvenient." They drank together, 4 people who'd found each other through revelation and crisis, forging bonds stronger than blood alone could create. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across Ashford Park's ancient lawns. Inside, the future, uncertain but chosen, stretched before them with possibility. The Duke's late father had unsealed a secret with his final letter. His sons had transformed that secret into foundation for something truer than any lie of omission could sustain. They'd learned what the late Duke never fully understood, that honor isn't avoiding difficult truths, but having the courage to acknowledge them and build something better from the ruins of comfortable deception. And in that acknowledgement, both brothers had found not just legitimacy of birth, but legitimacy of purpose, the freedom to bloom where they were planted. Roots deep in truth, even when the soil of revelation had initially seemed too bitter to nourish growth. If you enjoyed this journey through Regency England, through secrets revealed and families remade, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. Stories of honor and truth are universal, but I'd love to know where this one has traveled. Thank you for listening.